the title that I prefer is Getting and Spending, We Lay Waste Our Powers, which a Wordsworth way of talking about the rise of the market in the early 19th century. And so the theme is really on the expanding reach of the market, and by that I really mean the reach not only across space and across areas of life, but into our minds, into our very being. So the first words that I wrote about this are in the paper: the world of the market, of getting and spending, is evermore with us and also within us. And I'd like to stress that, because in a way that's the most important thing that I want to end up talking about. Where us, of course, means more and more people across the planet. Now, more and more of us see market relations and activities involving buying, selling, and investing as normal and natural. In their new book, Gendrez and Amartya Sen, about India, they write that in recent years, market phobia has subsided greatly in India. While that's useful, it's important not to be gripped by the market mania of wanting to marketize everything that can be handed over to the market. So I'm going to make the assumption, it's not exactly my argument, but I'm going to assume that each of these two pathologies, the phobia and the mania, result from an exclusive one-sided view of the relation, to quote Milton Friedman for the last time, the first and last time, the relationship between capitalism and freedom. That's really the topic. Now, Wordsworth's thought in his great poem was that the world is too much with us, in the sense that as the market expands, that we lay waste our powers and have given our hearts away. This, of course, this idea is a very old one, and I noticed it was voiced this morning from a member of the audience. It was a familiar theme of the Romantics. It was taken up by Coleridge, claiming that the true seat and sources of the existing distress are to be found in the overbalance of the commercial spirit, and by the deeply, it also, and this is Deirdre referred to, Carlyle, who lamented Victorian society's ruthless commercialism and destruction of pre-modern communal bonds and the dismal science of political economy. She referred to that. And it's interesting, I guess people know this, but it is fascinating that the Communist Manifesto in 1848 actually takes up Mark Carlyle's actual phrase of the cash nexus, where Marx and Engels write of the brutish, Carlyle wrote of the brutish God-forgetting profit and loss philosophy, and Carlyle wrote that cash payment is not the sole nexus of man with man, and that exact phrase is taken up by Marx and Engels, who talk about the spread of capitalism across the world, spread of markets, and drowning its inhabitants in the icy waters of egotistical calculation. Such a wonderful translation of that German text. Now, the basic underlying theme, this theme, is, of course, an ancient one, and it all goes all the way back, I'm sure beyond, but at least as far back as the biblical declaration of the impossibility of serving both God and mammon, and the episode of Jesus cleansing the temple by expelling the money changers. And it spreads also across the centuries in denunciations of avarice and greed and usury, of course, within Christianity. And of course there are parallels in other religions. Romanticism supplied something new, namely, what was new to the times, namely a response to the onset of the Industrial Revolution, the rise of capitalism. And here were the beginnings of the conflict of views that is still with us, and on this I want to focus. Now, I'm going to start off by just reminding you, or telling you if you haven't read it, of the rather wonderful discussion by Albert Hirschman, who recently died, in his luminous essay displaying his characteristic deep simplicity and elegance of thought he talked about the essay in question called Rival Views of Market Society. And these, he had four. And the four were these. First of all, there was the thesis, which you find in Adam Smith and others, of doux commerce, of gentle commerce. You find it in Montesquieu, it's James Stewart, about whom we're going to hear later in this conference. You find it in Condorcet, in whom I'm particularly interested. You find it in Thomas Paine. And basically, this is the idea, to quote Hirschman, that a society where the market assumes the central position for the satisfaction of human wants will not only produce considerable new wealth because of the division of labor and consequent technical progress, but will generate as a product or external economy a more polished human type, more honest, reliable, orderly, and disciplined, as well as more friendly and helpful, ever ready to find solutions to conflicts and a middle ground for opposed opinions. So this familiar thesis is that commerce, in other words, that commerce and industry encourage the virtues of industriousness, assiduity, frugality, punctuality, and most importantly, for the functioning of a market society, probity, honesty. Now, that's the familiar story of the 18th century. But then, of course, in the 19th, you get a very strikingly opposite view, which you find, of course, in Marx and Engels and elsewhere, and this is what Hirschman calls the self-destruction thesis, the idea, in other words, that markets, rather than generating the requisite dispositions, tend to deplete or erode them. In other words, that the market undermines the very moral values that are its essential underpinning. And this idea, in other words, is that the individualistic, rationalistic basis of the market undermines religious support, for instance. And you find this idea in quite a number of contemporary writers. One, for example, is Titmuss, Richard Titmuss, who, generalizing his claim that buying and selling blood crowds out altruism, argues in a more general way about the corrosive effects of buying and selling. And the Marxists are central to this idea, but there's also, I think the classic statement of this is Karl Polanyi, according to whom the great harm that the market system did for him was to unravel social bonds, the great transformation consisting in the disembedding of the economy in the world transforming project of building a self-regulating market economy. And Polanyi thought that land, labor, and money were fictitious commodities, and that marketization of these led to the destruction of livelihoods, habitats, and communities, and so to the constant, and hence to fascism and the First World War, but the Second World War. And so basically the Great Transformation was a disaster because of the disembedding of the economy. Now, there are two more views in Polanyi's, in Hirschman, which are worth remembering. The third view is the opposite of the self-destruction idea. It's the idea that Hirschman calls it the Feudal shackles thesis. And that is the idea that the problem with capitalism wasn't its corrosive power, abolishing the conditions for capitalist functioning, but rather the weakness of the market. In a number of societies that have been penetrated by capitalism and criticized and considered to be in trouble because of the penetration of the market has been too partial, timid, half-hearted, with substantial elements in the previous social order being left intact. So it's the survival of the past into the present that's the problem. You find this in Marx himself, and also in other Marxist writers who regret and talk about the failure to complete the bourgeois revolution. And you find that among neo-Marxists talking about dependent economies in the capitalist periphery, and others. And that thesis is a familiar one. It contradicts the self-destruction thesis, but then it in turn, in a very elegant way, Hirschman argues, contrasts with what he calls the feudal blessings thesis. And that is the idea that which celebrates rather than deploring the virtues of a feudal past, viewed as the indispensable seedbed of both Western democracy and capitalism. So the blessings on this fourth view are, when they are absent, a source of difficulties and a curse in disguise. And the example of this is the United States, where instead of becoming, according to Louis Hartz, the very lack of feudal remnants resulted in a lack of ideological diversity, and so the absence of an authentic conservative tradition and the weaknesses of socialist movements, and so, in general, the problems of American exceptionalism, the failure to consolidate the New Deal reforms and welfare state schemes into a new economic order. Now, I've gone through all of this because just to show in some way the scope of the debate, but the point is that there is at the heart of it something on which I want to focus. These four views that I've just run through are really about the relationship between the preconditions for capitalism and its likely success. But basically, the problem of what they do is that they suggest, Hirschman suggests that these contradictions, these different positions, are actually not as opposed as they might seem. So that, for instance, when talking about the gentle commerce and the self-destruction thesis, he suggests that the moral basis of capitalist society should be seen as being constantly depleted and replenished at the same time. In other words, he is a master, Hirschman, at showing how these contradictory processes can actually be coexistence. The problem is that these views, and from my purpose in the talk I'm now giving, these are in a way too complex for an easy discussion, because each of them is a package and each of them makes a different normative assumption. What I want to do here is narrow the focus by concentrating on one of the elements, which is indeed the central element that's at work in these things, in these arguments, in these rival views, namely focus on the very activity of buying and selling and investing. How are we to conceive of these practices and dispositions, and the disposition to engage in them? Are they manifestations of freedom or of growing subjection? What exactly does the rivalry of views in this case amount to? Do they exclude one another? Or do these alternative views, as Hirschman is inclined to suggest, pick out aspects of what occurs that are mutually compatible? Or are they only sometimes compatible, and if so, when? And what is the role of facts? That's the basic thing I want to find out. What's the role of facts in deciding this question? And to what extent is it what I call a duck-rabbit question? Is it just a question of how you look at it? I mean, and therefore irresolvable by argument. So what are the alternative views about freedom and capitalism and the market? So let's begin with, as Hirschman himself does, with the very idea of interests, pursuing your interests. Here Hirschman is helpful because he rightly suggests that the very concept of interest got stabilized in the 18th century to signify self-centeredness, the rational calculation of material costs and benefits, and more specifically money-making and the methodical pursuit and accumulation of private wealth. So material pursuit of interests, what Deirdre this morning called prudence, but prudence with a material slant. That is certainly how Adam Smith thought about it, and when he talked about the famous passage about the brewer and the baker pursuing their interests rather than exercising benevolence. It's what James Mill meant, and others. The scope of what counts as interests pursued, of course, expands as history proceeds. And, of course, there's always a danger of tautology, of saying that whatever you do is what's in your interests. But nevertheless, there is a consistent, clear idea at work here, and it's at the heart of economics, mainstream economics. The concept of interest, in other words, even when it incorporates the very idea of long-term or enlightened self-interest, it's always this idea of the pursuit of one's usually material purposes, advantages in a complex world, competitive world of scarcity. Now, as applied to market behavior, individuals' rational pursuit of their interests, which economists come to describe as choices that exhibit revealed preferences, maximizing utility under constraints. Deirdre talked about that this morning. This continues to be seen as manifesting freedom on this view. So, one view, in other words, the view that I'm going to focus on here and its critics, the view is, in other words, that the exercise of economic freedom, so thus understood, is to be promoted, perhaps maximized and defended against its major critics and enemies. So what do these say? Now, there are several versions of the contrary view, of the critique of the pursuit of interests. And these are different ways of putting this exercise of economic freedom into question. Either, and so here are the three ways. Either because the pursuit of interest, jeopardizes other values, because it does actual harm, or because it is merely a means to other higher, more worthy values. Now, we've already seen Coleridge and Carlyle doing this, and there's this line of thought, which you also find in Edmund Burke, has a whole series of echoes today among both conservatives and communitarians. Markets upset hierarchies, and markets can undermine solidarity. This idea was also, of course, there in Marx, as I already said, and it survives and it survives notably in the early manuscript on money in Marx. You see it there, and in the manifesto, and it survives among the followers of Marx. And he there gave Marx a vivid expression to the burgeoning theme of commodification. So I first want to talk about that, namely the idea that monetary exchange engenders a kind of corruption, which Marx thought debases or distorts the value of the good or service being exchanged, and he clearly believed that this in turn generates a kind of contagion, impairing or degrading otherwise well-functioning and potentially flourishing activities and commodities. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to elaborate on this idea, but there is a wonderful, I think wonderful, analysis of what this idea of commodification amounts to. There are really four ideas there, namely treating persons and things instrumentally. Secondly, when the goods are fungible, that's to say fully interchangeable, that's the second idea, is fungibility. And the third idea is commensurability, that's to say they can all be ranked on a single metric. And lastly, that this is all done in terms of money. And those four ideas are together involved in this very idea of commodification. And you might well ask the question, well, what's wrong with that exactly? For example, what did Marx and Engels think was wrong with it? And I think a proper discussion of this question has to involve looking at all those four components of what commodification is and asking what the harm involved is. But leaving that aside, and by the way, I also want to mention here that I think the most detailed and powerful exploration of this theme is to be found in Georg Simmel's Philosophy of Money, where he gives a marvelous and elaborate account of the effects of money, of transactions with money, of buying, selling, and investing upon the rest of life, and makes this very vivid. And there's a wonderful description in his essay on Metropolitan Mental Life of the effects of money and on modern cosmopolitan metropolitan life. But leaving all that aside, the two questions which this theme of commodification raises. Well, first, which goods and services and which kinds of interpersonal relations should be off limits to markets? Because this is something I would like to hear what people have to say about, and in particular Neera, who has been working on this, I mean, we clearly don't think that markets should be applicable to every kind of activity. We don't think, for example, that people should be bought and sold. We don't think that children should be bought, babies should be bought and sold. We don't think that votes should be bought and sold. What about kidneys? What about organ sales? And so on. There are many examples of potential commodities about which people sharply disagree. And market mania, to which I referred earlier, is the view that there should be no limits, or at least that the limits are very, very limited, very few. And so the question of when we should engage in this is a question that I would love to hear your views about. I think that a very interesting approach to this question is to be found in the sociologist Viviana Zelizer, who examines exactly this question from the point of view of a sociological problem. She, in a very Hirschman-like way, is very sensitive to the ways in which markets both do harm and do good at the same time. That, in other words, that in many spheres of interpersonal relations, commercial activity and intimacy, for example, are completely embedded one in the other. They interact. She writes, intimacy is certainly an area that separates spheres, hostile worlds proponents, in other words, people who think that these are forever to be separate, and the danger ensues when they are not. This has been intimacy is an area that people have been especially keen to protect from economic activity. Critics, moralists, social scientists at large have frequently thought not only that money corrupts, but more generally that economic rationality and the sentiments attached to intimate relations rest on fundamentally contradictory principles. To mix both, they argue, brings trouble. That's the commodification view. And she, by contrast, argues that people constantly mingle their most intimate relations with economic activities, including monetary payments, households, for instance, hotbeds of economic interaction. And instead of menacing alien intrusions, economic transactions repeatedly serve to create, define, sustain, and challenge our multiple intimate relations. It's a rich theme, and her work is very interestingly focused on it. But there are, of course, areas of life where the increasing prevalence of marketing and marketizing, that's to say rendering goods marketable, do seem harmful. In other words, you can take the Viviana Zelizer line, but on the other hand, what about the following examples? For instance, so-called Baumol goods, which the economist Baumol argued are services where the human touch is crucial and are resistant to labor productivity growth and resist standardization because treatment must be tailored to the individual case. There are many examples. He focused on the performing arts, but I would suggest teaching, doctoring, and policing are examples of spheres of life where the market really does seem to be a very intrusive form of allocation. And I say this as a Brit living in the United States, where the role of the market in the distribution of medicine is particularly disturbing. Think about the consumption of drugs and painkillers, the speeding up of consultation, the very fragmentation of medical services. I think the US healthcare system strikes me anyway, as exemplifying in an acute form the corruption of medical service provision by the prevalence of market incentives, leading physicians to see their medical practice as a revenue stream. But anyway, I know this is a controversial set of questions, and I'd love to hear what people think. There is another argument which is quite distinct from the corruption argument about the question when markets are invasive or appropriate and when they're not. And this comes from a book by Deborah Zatz called Why Some Things Should Not Be for Sale, where she thinks that in certain spheres the existence of a market has a serious effect upon equality, or generates inequality, but not economic inequality, but equality of standing. And the example that she takes, but you could apply this to other cases than this one, is prostitution, where women's sexual labor is a kind of theater of inequality, she says. In other words, because it displays for us a practice in which women are seen as servants of men's desires, and it shapes and influences the very ways in which women as a whole are seen. In other words, stigma surrounds this practice and is reinforced by it. You could say that, hypothetically, in an imaginary world, in a world you imagine, things might be otherwise, and there would be nothing wrong with prostitution in that world. But she thinks that, and I think there's a powerful case for it, that if you see prostitution as a kind of sex therapy fulfilling a legitimate social need, you're not talking about the world we live in. In other words, you're imagining where there are a world in which there are alternative conceptions of sexuality and gender. She writes, attacking feminists who think this, that they've minimized the cultural stereotypes that surround prostitution, exaggerating their own power to shape the practice. So her argument is that the power is to justify the powerful intuition that prostitution is intrinsically degrading because it's bound up with well-entrenched views of male gender identity and women's sexual role in the context of that identity. So prostitution is connected to stigma and unequal status and thus to injustice. And this is not going to change in any feasible world in the foreseeable future. Now, economic liberty. I've said rather briefly, and I fear a bit telegraphically, what I have to say about the commodification argument. But that's to say where you could say that the market is doing harm. But as I said before, you could also put a question beside the idea of economic liberty as promoted by markets, where it's not valued in itself but viewed instrumentally, but not just that case, but where it's a mere transitional value, something worth having merely as a means to the attainment of higher, more worthy purposes. That idea, in other words, that economic liberty is to be promoted, but not for its own sake, only because it's going to lead to something more worthy. And this was the view, the rather high-minded view that you find in John Stuart Mill, but also in Keynes, interestingly, who wrote that the strenuous, purposeful moneymakers may carry all of us along with them into the lap of economic abundance, but it will be those people who can keep alive and cultivate into a fuller perfection the art of life itself, and do not sell themselves to the means of life, who will be able to enjoy the abundance when it comes. In other words, look forward to a time when people no longer need to be slaves to the economic activities. And you find that idea in also in Rawls. Now, John Tomasi, who I'm glad to say is here and is going to talk after me, he quotes these passages from Keynes and so on, and he thinks that he contrasts contemporary social democracies, what he thinks of as its disdain for economic liberty, with what he prefers and argues, namely that economic liberty, which will be is to be advocated on Rawlsian grounds, because it can be justified to the least. Its promotion can be justified to the least advantaged, because it's a more inspiring idea. In other words, the promotion of, like I said before, material interests of individuals. And this idea, he quotes, he argues, is for a wide individual freedom of contract and powerful rights to the ownership of productive property. On the argument that such rights are needed for the independence of citizens, freeing them from reliance on the state regarding the provision of their most basic needs, such rights empower citizens as consumers, that is, as adults, that set long-term plans for themselves and then live and develop their own characters in the light of these goals. So, just going back to the Wordsworth of the idea of development of moral, laying waste our powers, Wordsworth thought that getting and spending lays waste our powers. Tomasi, whom we could at this point place alongside Wordsworth, his idea is that a social democratic state that curtails thick economic liberty, as he calls it, in pursuit of social justice, by reducing inequalities, this creates social conditions in which the moral powers of citizens can be exercised and developed in only a stunted way. So the exercise of such liberty is the basis for esteem from fellow citizens, self-respect, and self-authorship. The wealth that individuals acquire through the pursuit of these interests, economic interests, material interests, empowers them to become authors of their lives, he writes, become authors of lives that are truly their own. And appealing to Hayek as against Rawls, Tomasi writes that, quote, market democracies seek to depoliticize social life by commodifying it. The state creates a framework that supports the growth of a complex, spontaneous order, a cosmos in Hayek's terms. So that's the idea. Now, we come now to the points I want to make. So what I've tried to do in what I've said up to now is to show that the defense of robust economic freedom faces pursuit of interests, economic interests in a free way, free from interference. This faces several ways of putting it into question, several versions of a counter view or counter views. And these are first to claim that it jeopardizes other basic values, such as solidarity and equality. Secondly, that it brings about positive harm through commodification, and I went through that quickly. And thirdly, that it is merely a means to enable the realization of other more worthy human values. So that's Mill and John Stuart Mill, Keynes, and so on. And I cited the comment by at the beginning of what I said by Drees and Sen, that this discussion can become polarized into a standoff between market phobia and market mania. So now I want to conclude with a series of thoughts that raise the question of the extent to which it is possible to evaluate these rival views without ideological bias and by appealing to the evidence that is in turn ideologically unbiased. And I have to say, I mean, in the end, I think it is actually a duck-rabbit issue. I mean, I think in the end we are going to find that there are just conflicting perspectives, and I don't know how we get beyond that. So here are my thoughts. First, this linkage between economic liberty and growth, which was a major theme of Deirdre this morning, and which is also central to John Tomasi's book, Free Market Fairness, which I want to say, by the way, I like and admire very much. Now, what about the prospects for economic growth? John Tomasi prefers, as he puts it, enthusiastically capitalist regimes that embrace economic growth as a positive ideal, arguing that growth has changed the premises upon which the economic paternalism of the early social democratic theorists was based. And he calls social democracies in his book paternalist. Social democracies are paternalist. And why are they paternalist? Because they prioritize on the basis of need rather than allowing citizens to determine for themselves what it is that they want. But I think just on the question of economic growth, there are reasons to think, and I mean, in India it may not look like this, but in the United States and in other highly developed industrial societies, there are reasons to think that this enthusiasm for the future of growth may be both anachronistic and utopian. At least certainly as far, well, I say certainly, probably as far as the United States and maybe other advanced industrial societies are concerned. Quite apart, nobody's talked about this, from the ecological concerns about the accumulating consequences of growth for civilized life on the planet, which I would say, just in passing, suggests the urgent need to put up stop signs. There are several grounds, as Robert Gordon has recently argued, for questioning whether the extraordinary growth that was generated, not, as Deirdre said, at the beginning of the 19th century, or in 18th and 19th century, but rather since 1870, between 1870 and, say, 1920, the extraordinary spurt of capitalist growth then generated has been coming to an end. And the question is it likely to continue? And Robert Gordon, in this paper to which I refer in my paper here, argues that there are reasons to think, of course we can never know, that kind of extraordinary acceleration of growth is not happening and may well not be happening. It's an interesting fact that social democracy in the 20th century, especially in Northern Europe, during the 3 decades following the Second World War, was, of course, itself enabled by this very massive growth, of which we're seeing a great decline in the present time. Second thought, I think we need to ask the following question. What is the scope of defensible or justifiable economic freedom? I've already raised this question, but I'm raising it again. That's to say, of buying, selling, and investing. Is the answer to be... How are we going to answer that question? Is it the answer to be determined by whatever happens to be accepted as marketable? That is, by the scope of market practices at any given time and place. On that basis, the scope is continually widening. Or, as I've said, or is the answer to be determined by what one can justifiably claim to be the appropriate scope of the market? But now, when asking this question, I think we need to know what counts as economic liberty. We really need to realize that this is not a value-free question. We have to raise the question of when market relations and practices are appropriate and when they're not, and why. So when are markets noxious, harmful, and when, even more precisely, should the market component of practices, for instance, think of banking, medicine, be subject to extensive and detailed regulation and control? The market needs to be disaggregated in different kinds of markets and subject to evaluation of the effects of allowing their operation to go unregulated. We haven't... I'd really get worried about the polarization of this discussion. Market, non-market. What about regulating markets? And what about regulating different kinds of markets? Third thought. We need, I think, similarly consider the scope of market-like thinking in the analysis of relations and activities that are outside the scope of what we normally think of as economic. And Deirdre referred to that this morning. I mean, here the central name to conjure with is Gary Becker. To what extent is economic style understanding of other areas of social life, from politics and administration to intimate relations and family life, illuminated by conceptualizing these using the language of incentives, costs and benefits, trade-offs, pricing, and revealed preferences? I liked very much what Deirdre said this morning. There's more to life than prudence, she said. So I think there are at least two serious problems with these kinds of approaches, as illustrated by Becker and George Stiglitz. Namely, Stigler, I mean. The first of these problems is the very notion of revealed preference is, I think, a very questionable one, because it assumes the presence of some stable disposition that lies behind choices across multiple and varied situations, an assumption more plausible in some contexts and in some markets than in others. And again, Deirdre rightly said there are markets where you can make that assumption. Financial markets where there are standardized contexts that repeat themselves, that are reiterated, where this talk of revealed preference makes much more sense than in other kinds of contexts of life where you can't make that assumption. But the second big problem with applying economic style thinking, market-like thinking, to non-market, to non-economic life, is that this very way of analyzing behavior fails to distinguish between, and this is a point that needs more than, I'm just going to say rapidly, but it's a deep point, I believe, that you need to distinguish between tastes, which we just have, and values, about which we need to reflect and draw on our experiences and so on. And so there's a difference between changes of taste and autonomous reflective changes in values. That is a deep issue, but I'm going to move on to the fourth point that I want to make. And this is the key question of the relevance of factual evidence to the assessment of the evaluative question, namely, when is economic freedom to be valued, and what are we how are we going to decide this question of the praise and advocacy of economic liberty and its critique. Here, John Tomasi argues helpfully that to address the case for free market fairness, as he puts it, as against the high liberal and in particular social democratic case, the argument must be conducted at the level of what Rawls calls ideal theory. That is, by considering the alternative regime types, deciding where possible on the basis of what we know about historical, economic, and cultural life and what our knowledge tells us. So we have to know, in other words, what's ideally possible what's ideally to be desired in the light of what's possible. So possible doesn't mean feasible from any existing status quo. So, for instance, a relatively successful single-payer national healthcare system is certainly possible in the United States, but it's not feasibly attainable from anywhere in the present United States, from where you can't get there from here. Even though it's in some sense possible, it's not feasible. Now, Tomasi suggests that possible means that those conditions must pass what he calls the admittedly ambiguous test of sociological realism, and that they must be compatible with the general laws of political sociology. I have to say, I'm not convinced that there are any such laws. But nevertheless, Rawls too makes a similar argument from a social democratic point of view for his scheme. I submit that these are rather hand-waving like provisions. They don't explain anything. They don't help us, given the current state of our knowledge and the divisions among social scientists on some of the key issues involved. So now, but nevertheless, suppose we've solved this problem, and suppose, in other words, we've reached some degree of consensus about the facts and can now focus on the central moral issue. Advocates of the promotion and, if you like, maximization of economic liberty see the market activities of buying and selling goods and services and risk-taking investment as a central feature of a good life. Since and I'm again quoting John, for many people, commercial activity is in a competitive marketplace is a deeply meaningful aspect of their lives. People express themselves, they grow up and become who they are, in part because of their independent experience as independent participants in the cooperative venture that is economic life. Such activities, these advocates claim, minimize domination and coercion, which results from collective decision-making procedures, and enables people to secure wealth, which, in John Tomasi's words, empowers them to become authors of lives truly their own with a life script that each chooses to compose. Well, now is the moment for me to lay my cards on the table, I suppose. From a high liberal and social democratic viewpoint, which I'm sure you're guessing is mine, these claims express a bunch of illusions. So what are these illusions? One is the very idea of independent self-authorship. The idea that engaging in economic liberty renders those who believe this blind to both the contribution of others, to the background role of institutions, laws and norms, and to the role of luck. I seem to remember in the last election campaign in the United States, Obama said something like this, President Obama. He said something like, don't imagine that your success in business is just down to you. And he got hammered for it by all over the place by Romney, but also by right-wing radio. But Obama was right, in my view. That is to say, that this idea that, when you exercise economic liberty, that's you're the author of your own life, that is an illusion. Secondly, the second illusion is the idea that market freedom renders market actors free from coercion and domination, which is something you often hear. And you certainly hear it in libertarian writings, and you hear it, for example, you hear it in Hayek, and John Tomasi makes this argument too. Now, this illusion, I think, springs from the very way in which, on such views, freedom is conceived or conceptualized. The illusion springs from the very narrow conceptualization of freedom as freedom from arbitrary interference, which is the way Hayek defines it. On such a view, poverty, unemployment, and in general being a victim of bad luck in the market can't count as unfreedom. That's the second illusion. And the third illusion is to fail to see that individuals, supposed on this view to be authors of lives truly their own, are themselves deeply affected by the very markets in which they participate and are embedded. Adam Smith knew this, as did all those others in the 18th century. Markets shape preferences and capacities. In our own time, this has taken a far more troubling turn, where citizens and patients come to see themselves as consumers and risk-takers. Michel Foucault, commenting in a rather favorable way, actually, on the ideas of Gary Becker, observed as long ago as 1979 that with the advent of neoliberalism, the individual becomes an entrepreneurial self. Homo economicus, he wrote, is an entrepreneur of himself. And in consequence, the analysis of non-economic behavior through a grid of economic intelligibility and the criticism and appraisal of the action of public authorities in market terms becomes pervasive. So the neoliberal world, you might say, has become the world of everyday neoliberalism. So here's my last concluding thought. At this point in our discussion, it seems to me we've reached the duck rabbit. Or to take up a phrase from Wittgenstein, at this point our spade is turned. We've reached a kind of bedrock. Because I doubt very much whether anyone here who advocates and is in favor of what John Tomasi calls thick economic liberty, who takes the view to which these various critiques are addressed, and who embraces the virtues of the market, I very much doubt whether anyone who takes this position will be brought to see that what I've called illusions in these last remarks are indeed illusions. From a social democratic perspective, their view of economic liberty looks, how shall I say, Panglossian. In other words, it's the view that the world of everyday neoliberalism is the best of all possible worlds. Thank you.
In his careful discussion of the nature of free markets and their effect on morality and society, Professor Lukes argues that both market mania and market phobia stem from a one-sided view of the relationship between capitalism and freedom. He endorses Albert Hirschman's view that free markets have two contrary tendencies. On the one hand, they produce greater trust and empathy between people and more honesty in industry. On the other hand, they introduce calculation and instrumental reason into all spheres of life, thus undermining the moral values essential for markets to function well, such as, if I understand correctly, communal attitudes. This naturally leads to the question whether it would be better for everyone concerned if markets could be limited in their sphere of influence. Stephen raises many other interesting issues, but this is the one I will focus on. Before proceeding, however, I want to make some conceptual distinctions that are needed to bring clarity to the discussion, but that are often missing from critiques of free markets. One distinction is between free markets on the one hand and highly regulated markets or crony capitalism or economic socialism on the other. A second distinction is between market incentives as such and greed, or a desire to make money that is in some way inappropriate. So with these distinctions in mind, I want to evaluate Stephen's argument that some goods, services, and interpersonal relations should be off limits to markets, or at least not turned over entirely to markets and the market incentive. These include what he calls Baumol goods, those goods and services in which, to quote William Baumol, the human touch is crucial, and quality is, or is at least believed to be, inescapably correlated with the amount of human labor devoted to their production. Examples of such goods include medical practice and policing. Stephen argues that market incentives have corrupted the US healthcare system, leading physicians to see their medical practice as a revenue stream. He cites as an example the practice of some, perhaps many doctors, ordering unnecessary tests and procedures in order to make more money. That's a complaint that I've actually heard from quite a few people here as well. Luke suggests that the villain here is too much market freedom and too few regulations. I agree that doctors who see their ultimate goal as making as much money as possible rather than giving as good medical care as possible have corrupted their practice. But I have to disagree with Stephen's explanation of this phenomenon. Far from being a free market, the US healthcare system operates under a complex system of federal and state rules that drive up the cost of care, prevent competition among insurance companies and doctors, and ensure a lack of transparency in the cost of care. Neither those who get the care nor those who order it know what it costs. Much of this lack of competition and of transparency is, of course, due to lobbying by insurance companies and doctors' organizations. And much of the lobbying is due to their greed for making as much money as possible through unfair means. But success in lobbying is also due to politicians' greed for power and money, which only goes to show that greed and injustice have no special connection to markets or market incentives. All they need to flourish is a system that encourages them and a political system that gives politicians the power to grant special protections to certain groups, or in other words, crony capitalism is such a system. That there's no special connection between free markets on the one hand and greed and injustice on the other can also be seen if we turn our attention to non-market institutions such as the police. In the US now, the police may forfeit your property, your car, money, house, motel, jewelry, on no more than a suspicion that you violated any of a myriad laws or regulations. You don't have to be charged with a crime, leave alone convicted of one, to lose your property. First you lose your property, and then you can't afford to hire a lawyer, and then, of course, you lose the case, even when there is no case. Police departments across the country use civil forfeiture as a means of buying fancy cars and weapons, building fancy offices, and so on. In a dusty little town in Texas called Tenaha, out-of-town travelers are often stopped and given the choice of either facing felony charges and losing custody of their children, or allowing the police to rob them legally of their valuable possessions. If anyone is interested in reading about this, you can go to the New Yorker from August 2013. There's an article called Taken by Sarah Stillman, and the Institute for Justice has done a lot of work on civil forfeiture. Stephen is sympathetic to Deborah Satz's argument in her book, Why Some Things Should Not Be for Sale, that markets in goods or services that reflect or promote inequality should be banned. Examples include prostitution, child labor, and sale of bodily organs such as kidneys. With respect to the last, Satz argues that inequality would be reinforced by allowing markets because only the poor would sell their kidneys and only the rich would buy them. So the rich would, in effect, be using the poor as a mere means to their ends. Now, even if Satz is right about the facts and right in her evaluation, it doesn't follow that kidney markets should have been banned or should remain banned. Bans on voluntary commercial transactions, after all, are imposed by governments, that is, by the well-off and powerful, and necessarily increase the coercive reach of the government. So they always reflect and reinforce the political inequality between government and private individuals or groups. And replacing an inequality in voluntary financial transactions with coercion and political inequality does not seem to me to be an improvement. Now, Satz has other objections to global kidney markets that are well taken, but I don't think that they support a global ban on such markets. In a poor country like India, it's true that only desperately poor people will sell their kidneys, and that they are often the victims of unscrupulous brokers who cheat them of their money and surgeons who perform substandard surgeries on them and leave them without proper medical care. Unfortunately, though, banning kidney markets, as India and other countries have done, under pressure from Western governments and international organizations, has only driven the market underground, thus leaving the poor even more vulnerable than before. The ban has also created more rent-seeking opportunities for bureaucrats who now have the power to harass potential donors who need their permission to donate a kidney, but you cannot get the permission without wading through several yards of red tape, multiple layers of bureaucracy, and absurd last-minute additional requirements, like, well, not only must you agree to donate your kidney, but also your husband and your children and your siblings, and so on and so forth. So while I agree that the legal kidney market in India and elsewhere was often exploitative, even involuntary, replacing it with an involuntary and exploitative black market and a new bureaucracy with life or death power over people merely compounds the injustice. Stevens closes his discussion with a criticism of the view that a free market society empowers people, as John Tomasi puts it, to become authors of lives truly their own, and that commercial activity in a competitive marketplace is a deeply meaningful aspect of their lives. Stevens thinks that from the social democratic viewpoint, these views express several illusions. The first illusion is the very idea of self-authorship, because in reality, those of us who succeed in life are beneficiaries of good institutions, laws, other people's contributions, and good luck. Now, the idea of independent self-authorship would indeed be an illusion if those of us who regard it as morally important thought that self-authorship meant making ourselves de novo, free from all influence from any external factors. But I doubt that anyone who is not still a teenager is guilty of such an elementary error. The concept of self-authorship is analogous to the concept of authorship of a work, a book or a play, or a piece of art. So when we say, for example, that Shakespeare was the sole author of Hamlet, we don't mean that he owed nothing to any other writer, much less that he taught himself to think and read and write from scratch. So too, I would say, the concept of self-authorship. The second illusion, according to Stephen, is the illusion that market freedom is freedom from all coercion and domination. He argues that this is a very narrow conception of freedom because poverty, unemployment, and bad luck are also forms of unfreedom. In other words, freedom is more than negative freedom, and coercion is more than positive coercion, like a gun to the head or the threat of prison. I have no strong objection to the positive conception of freedom as yet another conception of freedom, and I'll grant for the sake of argument that poverty and so on can be forms of coercion and domination. Again, however, defenders of robust economic freedom point out that poverty and bad economic luck are much less likely in a free market society than in a social democratic, socialist, or aristocratic society. Further, those who suffer poverty or bad luck in a free market society are at least free of political coercion and domination. So in a free market society, the defender of free markets will argue, more people are more free in both senses of the term. The third illusion Stephen decries is related to the first. It's the failure to see that we are not authors of our own lives because our preferences and capacities are shaped by the very markets in which we live. This is a point that Deborah Satz also discusses at length. As Stephen himself points out, however, this latter fact was recognized by Adam Smith and others who subscribed to the do commerce thesis. Perhaps Gary Becker, whom Stephen mentions in this context, doesn't recognize it, but Becker doesn't represent every defender of free markets. At any rate, all societies shape our preferences and capacities, so the question is, which kind of society best equips us to lead our lives as independent agents, properly understood? If free market societies do this better than social democratic or socialist or aristocratic societies, then we have yet another reason to want free market societies. Stephen concludes by remarking that the advocates of robust economic liberty believe that, quote, the world of everyday neoliberalism is the best of all possible worlds, close quote. But if by this Stephen means the US or other mixed economies, I think they're far from the world of robust economic liberty. Rather, they are societies in which there is some genuine economic liberty, a great deal of cronyism, and a great deal of power in the hands of politicians. In the US, across the country, police are shutting down children's lemonade stands because the children don't have licenses. I mean, it's reached, you can't make it up. You can't make up some of the things that are going on there. So it may be that there has never been and never will be a robustly economically free society, but it may still be the only ideal that we need to try to It may still be the one ideal that we need to try to approximate if we are to achieve greater equality, both political and economic.
I'm going to just respond to one thing. Well, of course, you're quite right about Shakespeare. I mean, self-author. I still think that this idea that you've done it on your own. Of course, I mean, you're quite right. Only an adolescent would think that, I think you'd have to be probably age 4 rather than an adolescent to think that you've done everything yourself. But still, I do think that this idea of, I mean, the role of class, social class, and just general advantage in that people who are economically successful plays in economic success gets occluded, I think, by this notion of self-authorship. But there's just one thing you said which I do want to respond to, and then I'd like to hear what other people think. You said, when talking about this business of coercion and domination, that, and you conceded that, okay, we don't have to have a very narrow negative view of freedom. We can operate with a wider one. But nevertheless, you said it's just still the case that, and then you put together various different kinds of oppressive societies. You said socialist, social democratic, and other kinds of society. You say are societies where it's plainly the case that the role of domination and coercion is greater. Well, I revert to actually a question I raised this morning. I mean, what is this? Social democracies are places, I mean, think, for example, of Scandinavia, where I just don't think this is even remotely true. I mean, in other words, I think that you're doing what I think Deirdre was doing also, which is to put social democratic societies, which are after all capitalist societies, in the same boat as societies that were plainly not only economic failures but political disasters. For example, the Soviet Union and China, and so I mean I just. And then I'm going to stop. Social democracy seems to me to be a form of capitalism which embodies the notion of regulated markets, which are welfare states, and which are indeed promoters of economic liberty, but within limits. And I don't see why this is to be lumped together with other cases of social and political failure.